Ethan Carter has worked hard to escape his father's shadow, determined to succeed on his own terms. But when a routine flight takes a shocking turn, Ethan faces blatant bias that forces him into a fight he never expected, one that could redefine an entire industry. As Ethan battles corporate resistance and his own inner conflicts, he's pushed to his limits. Can he turn this moment of injustice into lasting change, or will the pressure be too much? Join Ethan's powerful journey of confronting bias, reshaping corporate culture, and building a legacy that matters. Want to know what happens next? Watch the full story and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to stay updated with more compelling stories. Share your thoughts below. What would you do in Ethan's shoes? Ethan Carter stood in his Dallas office, staring out over the city skyline. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting an orange glow over the glass buildings that stretched out in every direction. He sipped his coffee, the dark liquid soothing the familiar twinge of anxiety in his chest. Today was an important day, one he'd been preparing for weeks, and the weight of its significance sat heavily on his shoulders. At 28, Ethan had made a name for himself in the finance world, though not in the way many had expected. His rise had been quiet, deliberate, earned through hard work rather than through leveraging his father's wealth and influence. Malcolm Carter, Ethan's father, was a self-made billionaire and founder of Carter Air, one of the most successful private airlines in the world. The Carter name was synonymous with wealth and power in Dallas, a name that opened doors, closed deals, and invited respect. Yet, despite that, Ethan had always wanted to succeed on his own terms. He wasn't interested in being Malcolm Carter's son. He wanted to be Ethan Carter, a man known for his own accomplishments. While many in his social circle had grown up with silver spoons in their mouths, coasting on their family names, Ethan had fought to build a career based on merit. He had seen how the wealth and influence of the elite could warp people's perception. Assumptions were made, and doors opened not for what you could do, but for who you were born to. Ethan wasn't willing to take that path. The journey hadn't been easy. After graduating from one of the country's top business schools, Ethan had joined Harper & Blythe Capital, a major investment firm headquartered in Dallas. He had started at the bottom, determined to prove himself. He worked grueling hours, never missing an opportunity to outwork his peers, to learn the intricacies of the business. It had paid off slowly. By his late 20s, Ethan had risen through the ranks, now holding a senior position at the firm. His sharp mind, unrelenting work ethic, and a reputation for fairness had earned him respect in the industry. Still, there was always that lingering shadow. No matter how hard he worked, no matter how successful he became, there were always whispers. That's Malcolm Carter's son. Some viewed his success as inevitable, as if his last name had been the key to every door he had walked through. But today, none of that mattered. He had a flight to catch, a deal to secure. A New York tech company, one of the largest in the industry, was interested in forming a partnership with Harper & Blythe, and Ethan had been chosen to lead the negotiations. Securing this deal would mean everything. It would prove once and for all that his success wasn't about his last name, was about his talent, his ability. Setting down his coffee, Ethan grabbed his briefcase and headed out the door. His mind was already turning over the details of the meeting ahead: numbers, projections, key talking points. He had rehearsed it all 100 times, but he knew the stakes were high. If he could close this deal, it would be the crowning achievement of his career. And he was more than ready for it. The Carter family wasn't just known for wealth. They were a symbol of success, determination, and hard work. Malcolm Carter's rise from humble beginnings to billionaire status was the stuff of legend. He had built Carter Air from the ground up, transforming it into one of the premier private airlines in the world. In Malcolm's eyes, hard work was the key to success, and he had passed that belief on to his son. But while Malcolm had always been supportive of Ethan's career, their relationship had grown strained in recent years. Ethan often felt that his father didn't fully understand why he had chosen a path outside of the family business. While Malcolm had built his empire, Ethan had made it clear that he wanted to forge his own path. It wasn't that he didn't respect what his father had accomplished, he did. But Ethan didn't want to live in the shadow of Malcolm's success. Their conversations about work were often tense. Malcolm couldn't understand why Ethan didn't use his connections more, why he insisted on doing things the hard way. "You've got all the tools right in front of you," Malcolm had told him more than once. "Why not use them?" Ethan's mother, Leah Carter, was a different story. A calming presence in the family, Leah had always supported her son's choices, even when she didn't fully understand them. She was the bridge between Ethan and Malcolm, easing the tension with a gentle word or a knowing look. Ethan appreciated his mother's quiet support, but there was a part of him that still wanted his father's approval, even though he would never admit it. On the morning of his flight to New York, Ethan had briefly considered calling his father to tell him about the deal. But he hesitated. This was his moment, and he didn't want Malcolm to swoop in with advice or suggestions on how to handle it. This was something he needed to do on his own. As Ethan drove to Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, he thought about the conversations he'd had with his father over the years. There was always an underlying tension, a feeling that Malcolm was waiting for him to fail so he could step in and offer his help. It wasn't that Malcolm didn't trust Ethan, it was more that he couldn't let go of the idea that his son should follow in his footsteps. But Ethan had no intention of taking over Carter Air. He didn't want to be the next Malcolm Carter. He wanted to be himself, and this deal in New York was the first real opportunity he had to prove that he could succeed on his own terms. It was a bright, warm morning as Ethan navigated through the sprawling corridors of Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. The airport was buzzing with activity, as it always was, with travelers rushing to catch flights, dragging suitcases, and sipping overpriced coffee as they made their way to their gates. Ethan moved easily through the crowd, blending in despite his affluence. He wasn't the type to flaunt his wealth. In fact, he often went out of his way to avoid drawing attention to himself. Dressed casually in jeans, a black hoodie, and a pair of worn sneakers, Ethan looked like any other young professional traveling for work. He preferred it that way. He had seen how wealth changed people, how it created distance, how it attracted attention. He didn't want that. He wanted to be judged for his abilities, not his bank account. After a smooth check-in and security process, Ethan arrived at the gate with time to spare. He had flown out of DFW countless times, and the familiarity of the airport was comforting. As he waited to board, his mind was already turning to the upcoming meeting in New York. The presentation he had prepared was flawless. He had made sure of that. His talking points were sharp, his numbers solid. Now it was just a matter of execution. When the boarding announcement was made, Ethan stood up with the other first-class passengers. He pulled his boarding pass from his pocket, feeling the weight of the ticket between his fingers. Despite his casual appearance, Ethan always flew first class. It wasn't about the luxury, it was about the space, the quiet, the ability to focus on work without distractions. As he approached the gate, he handed his boarding pass to the gate agent, who scanned it with a smile and wished him a pleasant flight. Ethan nodded, thanked her, and continued down the jet bridge. His mind was already on the meeting ahead, mentally rehearsing the key points of his pitch, the flow of the conversation he hoped to have with the prospective clients. He barely noticed the flight attendant standing at the entrance to the aircraft. Her name tag read Emily Davis. She was young, in her late 20s, with sharp features and an air of disinterest that immediately set Ethan on edge. As he handed her his boarding pass, she barely glanced at it before making a dismissive gesture with her hand. "Your seat is in the back," she said flatly, not bothering to look him in the eye. Ethan frowned, momentarily confused. He knew his seat was in first class, seat 1A to be exact. He double-checked his boarding pass before responding, keeping his voice calm. "Actually, I'm in first class," he said, handing the boarding pass back to her. Emily sighed dramatically, rolling her eyes as she glanced at the ticket again. Her gaze swept over Ethan's casual attire, and her tone dripped with condescension. "Are you sure you can afford that seat?" For a brief moment, Ethan was stunned. He had encountered rude customer service before, but this was different. This wasn't just about a bad attitude. This was about an assumption she had made based on how he looked. He could feel the frustration bubbling up inside him, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Yes, I'm sure," he replied, his voice steady. Emily gave the ticket another glance, her expression changing slightly. There was a flicker of surprise in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by the same cold indifference. She handed the ticket back to him without a word and gestured for him to board. As Ethan made his way to his seat, he could still feel the weight of her scrutiny. He sat down in the plush first-class seat, trying to shake off the strange interaction. He had more important things to worry about: the meeting, the deal, the future of his career. But the encounter with Emily lingered in his mind, a sour note at the start of what was supposed to be a smooth journey. Ethan tried to focus on the upcoming meeting, pulling out his phone and reviewing his notes for the presentation. But the encounter with Emily continued to gnaw at him. He had dealt with subtle forms of prejudice before. He knew the look, the tone, the assumptions people made based on the color of his skin or the way he dressed. But it still stung. He had worked hard to get to this point, to earn his place in first class, and he resented the fact that someone like Emily could so easily undermine that with a few dismissive words. He wasn't angry. He had learned long ago that anger only gave people like her power over him. But he couldn't help but feel frustrated by the principle of it. As the plane filled with passengers, Ethan noticed how Emily's demeanor changed with the other first-class travelers. She greeted them with bright smiles, helping with their bags, addressing them by name. But when she passed by Ethan's seat, there was a coldness in her eyes, as if she couldn't even bring herself to acknowledge him. He told himself he was overreacting, that he was reading too much into the situation. But as the flight took off and reached cruising altitude, the rudeness continued. When Emily came down the aisle to serve drinks and snacks, she passed right by Ethan without even a glance in his direction. She stopped at the other passengers' seats, chatting politely with them, offering a wide selection of drinks and snacks. But when it came to Ethan, it was as if he didn't exist. At first, Ethan tried to brush it off. He was used to being overlooked in spaces where people like him weren't expected to be. But as the flight continued, the frustration grew. He waited patiently, thinking she might come back around and offer him a drink. But when she passed him for the third time, he realized this wasn't a mistake. She was intentionally ignoring him. Ethan wasn't the type to cause a scene, but as he sat there, ignored and disrespected, he began to wonder if he should say something. It wasn't about the drink or the snacks, it was about the principle. He had paid for his seat, just like everyone else in first class, and he deserved to be treated with the same respect. But the idea of speaking up felt uncomfortable. What if he was overreacting? What if he was reading too much into it? His thoughts were interrupted by a quiet voice from across the aisle. A middle-aged man in a neatly pressed business suit leaned over slightly, catching Ethan's eye. "Don't take it personally," the man said in a low voice. "I've seen her pull this kind of thing before." Ethan raised an eyebrow, surprised. "What do you mean?" The man glanced at Emily, who was busy chatting with another passenger a few rows ahead, and then back at Ethan. "She has certain biases," he said carefully, his tone implying more than his words revealed. Ethan's stomach tightened. Biases was a word often used to soften the reality of something much uglier. Prejudice, racism, a sense of superiority. Ethan had dealt with these attitudes before, though they were often subtler, more difficult to pin down. It was in the way people looked at him, the way they talked to him, the way they made assumptions based on his appearance. But here, on a first-class flight in 2024, he hadn't expected to be treated differently because of the color of his skin. He had thought that in a space like this, where wealth and status were supposed to transcend race, he would be treated with the same respect as anyone else. And yet here he was. Ethan nodded to the man, appreciating the quiet support, but it did little to ease the frustration building inside him. He leaned back in his seat, staring out the window as the plane cruised high above the clouds. His mind raced, torn between the desire to confront the situation and the instinct to stay quiet, to avoid drawing more attention to himself. Halfway through the flight, Ethan decided he had had enough. He wasn't the type to make a scene, but he also wasn't the type to let disrespect slide. He had worked too hard to earn his place in this world to be treated like he didn't belong. When Emily passed by his row for the third time, still ignoring him, Ethan raised his hand politely. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Could I get a glass of water, please?" Emily stopped, turning toward him with a tight, forced smile. "Maybe later," she said curtly, before walking off without another word. Ethan was stunned. It wasn't just rude, it was outright disrespectful. He glanced around, wondering if anyone else had noticed. A few passengers had, and Ethan caught the eye of the man across the aisle again. The man gave him a sympathetic nod, clearly understanding what had just happened. Ethan felt the frustration boiling inside him. He had been patient, polite, and respectful. And yet Emily continued to treat him like he didn't deserve to be there. He had never been one to demand special treatment, but this wasn't about special treatment, was about being treated fairly. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He didn't want to let his emotions get the better of him, but he also couldn't sit by and let this continue. He deserved better than this. After a moment of reflection, Ethan stood up and made his way to the front of the cabin, where one of the other flight attendants was standing. "Excuse me," Ethan said, keeping his voice calm but firm. "Could I speak with the head of customer service?" The flight attendant, a young woman with kind eyes, nodded, clearly sensing Ethan's frustration. "Of course, sir," she said. "I'll have her come speak with you right away." A few minutes later, the head of customer service, Linda Morgan, approached Ethan's seat. She smiled warmly, but Ethan could see the concern in her eyes. She had clearly been briefed on the situation. "How can I help you today?" Sir Linda asked, her voice professional but compassionate. Ethan took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. He didn't want to come across as angry or confrontational, but he also knew he had a right to be treated fairly. "I've asked several times for basic things like water, and I've been repeatedly ignored by one of your flight attendants," Ethan said calmly. "I'm not sure why, but it seems personal." Linda's smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. "I'm very sorry to hear that, Mr. Carter," she said. "Can you tell me who it was?" Ethan pointed discreetly toward Emily, who was standing at the front of the cabin, her back turned to them. Linda glanced over and nodded, her expression growing more serious. "I'll take care of it right away," she said, her tone firm. As Linda walked away, Ethan sat back down, feeling a mix of relief and lingering frustration. He had spoken up for himself, but the situation wasn't over yet. What would happen next? Would Emily apologize? Would there be consequences for her behavior? Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by the buzzing of his phone. He glanced at the screen and saw a text message from his father, Malcolm Carter. "I heard what's happening on the flight. Don't worry, I'm handling it." Ethan stared at the message, momentarily stunned. How could his father possibly know what was going on? He hadn't told anyone about the situation, certainly not his father. Malcolm was a busy man, constantly traveling for business meetings, overseeing Carter Air, and managing a dozen other ventures. Ethan quickly typed a response, his fingers moving across the screen with urgency. "How did you find out I didn't say anything?" A few moments passed before his father replied. "I have my ways. Just sit tight. Everything's going to be fine." Ethan sighed, his frustration mingling with a sense of helplessness. His father had always been protective, sometimes to a fault. While Ethan appreciated Malcolm's concern, he wasn't a fan of being rescued. He had spent years trying to build his career on his own terms, without relying on his father's influence. And now, in the middle of this uncomfortable situation, it seemed like Malcolm was swooping in to fix things. Ethan was about to send another reply when something caught his attention. Emily had reappeared at the front of the cabin, but her demeanor had changed. Her face was pale, and she looked nervous, almost as if she were afraid to make eye contact with Ethan or any of the other passengers. She busied herself with trivial tasks, avoiding everyone's gaze. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Something had shifted, but he wasn't sure what. Had Linda said something to her? Or had his father pulled some strings behind the scenes? Whatever it was, Emily seemed rattled. Her confidence and sharp attitude had been replaced by a sense of unease. Ethan's phone buzzed again, another message from his father. "You'll be met by someone from the airline when you land in New York. They'll take care of everything. Trust me." Ethan felt a mix of emotions, gratitude, confusion, and a lingering frustration that his father had intervened, even though Ethan hadn't asked for help. As much as he appreciated his father's support, Ethan had wanted to handle this on his own terms. But now, it seemed like the situation was spiraling in a direction he hadn't anticipated. The tension in the air was thick as the plane continued its journey toward New York, and Ethan couldn't help but feel that this flight, which had started with subtle discomfort, was about to take a dramatic turn. As the plane sailed smoothly through the air, Ethan tried to settle back into his seat, but the tension in his shoulders never eased. He couldn't focus on his work. Instead, his thoughts kept circling back to Emily. The change in her demeanor after Linda spoke to her was noticeable, and it left Ethan uneasy. He hated not knowing what was happening behind the scenes. Was this problem actually being addressed, or was it being swept under the rug? Ethan glanced out the window. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting an amber glow over the clouds. The serene view was in stark contrast to the unease gnawing at him. He considered texting his father again to ask exactly what was going on, but he hesitated. He had always prided himself on solving his own problems. Relying on Malcolm's power felt like giving up some of his autonomy, and that was something Ethan had fought to protect. He tried to refocus on his meeting in New York. His firm was counting on him to secure the deal. The numbers were solid, the proposal airtight. If he could just shake off the unease of the flight, he would be ready to deliver his pitch and win the partnership. But Emily's cold treatment, the quiet whispers of other passengers, and his father's looming involvement all weighed heavily on him. As the flight attendants began making their rounds again, Ethan noticed that Emily was keeping her distance from him, her body language stiff and uncertain. She was handling the other passengers professionally, but she avoided even glancing in Ethan's direction. It was clear something had been said to her, but what? The flight seemed to stretch on forever, the minutes ticking by at a snail's pace. The once comfortable first-class cabin now felt like a confined space, thick with unspoken tension. Other passengers, too, had noticed the strange dynamic, but no one dared to say anything. Ethan caught the eye of the man sitting across from him again, the same man who had earlier whispered about Emily's biases. The man raised an eyebrow, his expression one of quiet sympathy, but it didn't offer much comfort. Ethan was on edge, and he was ready for this flight to be over. Hours later, the pilot announced they would begin their descent into John F. Kennedy International Airport. Ethan breathed a sigh of relief. His back was tense, his mind tired from going over the day's strange events. He stared at his phone, wondering if there would be any more cryptic messages from his father. As the plane descended through the darkening sky, the quiet whispers of other passengers grew louder. People were shifting in their seats, preparing for landing, but Ethan remained still, his mind racing. He had started this flight with nothing on his mind but the big deal awaiting him in New York. But now, everything had been derailed by one flight attendant's assumptions and disrespect. Had Emily's actions really been a result of her biases, or had Ethan overreacted, letting his frustrations get the best of him? The truth was, Ethan knew how these things worked. Bias was rarely overt. It was subtle, insidious. And the worst part, it left you doubting yourself, wondering if you were making too much of something that others would brush off. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling of injustice. He had paid for his seat just like everyone else, and he deserved to be treated with respect. As the plane touched down on the runway, Ethan felt his pulse quicken. He wasn't sure what to expect once they landed, but his father's earlier text had made it clear something was going to happen. The plane rolled to a stop, and the familiar ding of the seatbelt sign being turned off signaled the end of the flight. Passengers immediately began standing up, grabbing their bags from the overhead bins and shuffling toward the exit. Ethan stayed in his seat for a moment, watching as the crowd filed out. The tension in the air was palpable. People were clearly aware that something had happened, but no one knew exactly what. Even Emily seemed rattled as she remained stationed at the front of the cabin, her eyes downcast. Ethan stood up, retrieving his briefcase and laptop bag from the compartment above. He was one of the last to leave. As he walked toward the front of the plane, he caught a glimpse of Emily, who avoided eye contact with him entirely. Whatever had been said to her seemed to have stripped her of her earlier confidence, but Ethan wasn't sure if it was enough. When he stepped off the plane and into the terminal, 2 uniformed airline staff members were waiting for him. They were discreet, standing near the jet bridge entrance, scanning the faces of passengers as they deplaned. The moment they spotted Ethan, they walked toward him with calm professionalism. "Mr. Carter," one of them asked. Ethan nodded, though he felt a wave of discomfort washing over him. It felt surreal to be singled out like this. "We've been instructed to escort you to a private lounge," the staff member said, her voice low and respectful. "Your father and members of the airline's executive team are waiting for you there." Ethan's heart sank. His father had made good on his promise to handle things, but that meant Ethan was no longer in control of the situation. He followed the staff without a word, his mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. How had his father learned about the incident so quickly? What was Malcolm doing behind the scenes? The walk through the terminal was quiet. The hustle and bustle of the airport felt distant, muffled by Ethan's own thoughts. He had a sinking feeling that whatever was waiting for him in the lounge wasn't just about fixing a problem on one flight, was about much more than that. The private lounge was a stark contrast to the noisy terminal outside. The space was sleek and modern, furnished with plush seating, soft lighting, and walls adorned with abstract art. It was the kind of space reserved for high-profile passengers, executives, celebrities, and the ultra-wealthy who valued privacy above all else. Ethan had been in rooms like this before, but today it felt foreign to him. It was a reminder of the world his father had built, a world that Ethan had tried so hard to distance himself from. As soon as Ethan stepped inside, he saw his father. Malcolm Carter was standing near the large windows that overlooked the tarmac. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. Malcolm was a man who commanded attention wherever he went. His reputation as a business titan preceded him, and even at 60, his presence was formidable. Next to Malcolm stood Karen McNeil, the CEO of Sky North Airlines, her expression calm but serious. A few other executives, most likely from the airline's legal and HR departments, stood nearby. "Ethan," Malcolm said, his voice steady but with an underlying edge of concern. "I'm glad you're here." Ethan set down his briefcase and approached his father, but his attention was focused on Karen. "Mr. Carter," Karen began, stepping forward and extending her hand. "I want to personally apologize on behalf of Sky North Airlines for the events that occurred on your flight today. This type of behavior is unacceptable, and we're taking immediate steps to address it." Ethan shook her hand, but the apology felt rehearsed, corporate, distant. He appreciated the gesture, but it did little to soothe the anger simmering inside him. He had dealt with microaggressions like Emily's before, but this time it felt more personal, more blatant. "I appreciate the apology," Ethan said, keeping his voice measured, "but I'd like to understand why this happened in the first place. This wasn't just a mistake, it felt like a personal judgment." Karen's expression remained neutral, but Ethan could see the tension behind her eyes. She glanced at Malcolm, who gave her a nod of encouragement. It was clear that Karen was treading carefully, aware of the delicate balance she had to strike between protecting her airline's reputation and addressing a serious complaint from the son of one of the most influential men in the industry. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Carter," Karen said, her voice calm but firm. "We've already spoken with the flight attendant in question, and we'd like her to address this directly with you." Ethan's eyes narrowed. He hadn't expected that. At that moment, the door to the lounge opened, and Emily Davis entered, flanked by 2 senior members of Sky North's HR department. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with uncertainty. Gone was the sharp, dismissive attitude she had shown during the flight. Now she looked nervous, unsure of how to approach the situation unfolding before her. Emily stood at the entrance to the lounge, her posture tense and her eyes darting nervously between Ethan, Malcolm, and Karen. The confident, dismissive woman who had snubbed Ethan during the flight was nowhere to be seen. Instead, she looked vulnerable, her earlier indifference replaced by a nervous energy. "Mr. Carter," Emily began, her voice shaky but sincere, "I want to apologize for how I treated you during the flight. It was unprofessional, and I regret my actions. Ethan remained silent for a moment, studying her. There was a part of him that wanted to accept the apology and move on, but another part of him was still angry. Her actions hadn't just been unprofessional, they had been rooted in something deeper. Bias, prejudice, whatever word you wanted to use, it was all the same. She had judged him based on his appearance, and she had treated him differently because of it. "Why?" Ethan asked, his voice calm but firm. "Why did you treat me that way? Was it because of something I did, or was it because of something you assumed?" Emily's face flushed with embarrassment, and for a moment she looked like she might break down. I don't have an excuse," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I made assumptions, and I let my biases cloud my judgment. I've never been in this situation before, and I didn't realize how wrong I was until it was too late." Her confession hung in the air, and Ethan felt a surge of conflicting emotions. On the one hand, he appreciated her honesty. On the other, it wasn't enough. Apologies were easy, acknowledging the deeper reasons behind your actions was harder. Ethan sighed, his frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. "This isn't just about a mistake," he said. "It's about how people like me are treated, even in spaces where we're supposed to be equals. You didn't see me as a passenger. You saw me as someone who didn't belong. And that's not something you can just apologize away." Emily's shoulders slumped, and she looked down at the floor. "I know," she said softly. "I'm truly sorry." Karen stepped forward, her expression serious. "Emily's behavior was unacceptable, and we're committed to making sure this never happens again. We're implementing additional training for all of our staff, and Emily will be undergoing further disciplinary action." Ethan appreciated the steps they were taking, but it still didn't feel like enough. He had heard promises of training and reform before, but real change was hard to come by. And in a world where people like Emily could so easily act on their biases, it felt like an uphill battle. "This isn't just about one flight attendant," Ethan said, his voice calm but resolute. "It's about the culture that allows these kinds of assumptions to go unchecked. Training is a start, but it won't fix the root of the problem." Karen nodded, clearly understanding the gravity of the situation. "We recognize that, Mr. Carter, and we're taking steps to address it at every level of the company." Ethan glanced at his father, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. Malcolm's expression was unreadable, but Ethan could sense the tension beneath the surface. His father had always been a man of action, and Ethan knew that Malcolm wasn't one to let things slide. As the conversation wound down, Ethan felt a lingering sense of dissatisfaction. The apology had been made, and the promises of change had been delivered, but it all felt too neat, too polished. Was any of it genuine? Or was it all just damage control? Later that evening, after the confrontation in the lounge, Ethan found himself alone with his father in a quiet corner of the airport's VIP section. The lounge's soft lighting cast long shadows, and the low hum of distant voices barely registered as Ethan's thoughts raced. Malcolm watched his son carefully, his posture relaxed, but his gaze intense. "What's going through your mind, Ethan?" he asked, his voice even. Ethan let out a heavy sigh. "I don't know. I don't feel like any of this is real. It feels like they're just going through the motions, making promises they might not even keep." Malcolm nodded, understanding the frustration that was bubbling just beneath the surface. "You've got every right to feel that way. Change in these situations is rarely immediate. It takes time, and sometimes it doesn't feel like enough." Ethan looked at his father, feeling the familiar tension between them. "I didn't want you to get involved in this, Dad. I wanted to handle it on my own." "I know," Malcolm said, his voice softening. "But sometimes things spiral out of control faster than you expect. I didn't step in to take over, Ethan. I stepped in because I care. Because I want you to know that you don't have to fight these battles alone." The weight of his father's words hit Ethan harder than he expected. For years, he had been trying to carve out his own path, to prove that he could succeed without relying on Malcolm's power and influence. But in moments like this, he couldn't deny that his father's support was invaluable. "You're not alone in this fight, Ethan," Malcolm continued. "But you have to decide how you want to move forward. This isn't just about what happened on the flight, it's about how you handle situations like this in the future." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of his father's words. He knew his father was right. This wasn't just about one incident or one rude flight attendant. It was about something much bigger, something that went beyond him. "I guess I just don't know how to move forward from here," Ethan admitted quietly. "Do I keep fighting, or do I just let it go?" Malcolm leaned forward slightly, his gaze locked on his son. "You move forward by doing what's right, by standing up for yourself and for others. But you also need to know when to let go, when to trust that you've done enough, and that the responsibility for change doesn't rest solely on your shoulders." Ethan sat back, considering his father's words. He had always wanted to handle things on his own, to fight his own battles. But maybe his father was right, maybe some battles couldn't be fought alone. As the evening wore on, Ethan sat in his hotel room staring out at the New York skyline. The city buzzed with life below him, but he felt strangely detached from it all. The confrontation with Emily, the apology, the promises of change, it all weighed heavily on him. But as he sat there, reflecting on his father's words, something shifted inside him. He realized that this was just about one flight or one rude flight attendant. This was about the broader issue of bias, of systemic prejudice that still existed, even in spaces where people were supposed to be equals. And while he couldn't change everything, he could still make a difference. Ethan decided he wasn't going to let this incident be swept under the rug. He was going to hold the airline accountable, not just for what had happened to him, but for the larger issues that needed to be addressed. He picked up his phone and called Karen McNeil, the CEO of Sky North. "Karen, I've been thinking," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I want to be part of the solution. Let's work together to make sure this kind of thing doesn't happen again, not just at Sky North, but across the industry." Karen's voice brightened on the other end of the line. "I was hoping you'd say that, Ethan. We could really use your help." As he hung up the phone, Ethan felt a sense of clarity wash over him. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something much bigger. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt ready to take on the challenge. Ethan woke up early the next morning, his mind buzzing with the gravity of his decision. The conversation with Karen McNeil the previous night had left him feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't expected. He had spent years trying to distance himself from his father's legacy, but now he was stepping into a role that required influence, leadership, and the very connections he had once avoided.
Looking out of the sprawling skyline of New York City, Ethan felt a renewed sense of clarity.
He wasn't just going to be a passive player in the airline's attempts to fix a problem. He was going to be actively involved in shaping a new future for Sky North, and, possibly, the entire industry. The challenge ahead was daunting. He knew that pushing for real change in corporate culture would be met with resistance from those who had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. Some would view his involvement as nothing more than optics, a way for the airline to save face after the incident. But Ethan had no intention of being used as a token figure. He was determined to ensure that real, lasting change was made. He dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, something more fitting for the meetings ahead than his usual business casual attire. Today, he wasn't just another executive trying to close a deal. Today, he was stepping into a leadership role that would shape the future of a major corporation. As he prepared to leave his hotel, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from his father. "Malcolm Carter, good luck today. Proud of you. Let me know if you need anything." Ethan stared at the message for a moment before typing a short reply. "Ethan Carter. Thanks, Dad. I'll keep you posted." For years, Ethan had been reluctant to lean on his father's influence. But now, he understood that accepting help didn't mean he was any less capable. It just meant that he was choosing to use the tools available to him. And in this case, those tools could help him bring about the kind of change that was needed. The Sky North headquarters in New York City was buzzing with activity when Ethan arrived. The sleek modern building was a testament to the company's success, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered stunning views of the city and high-tech conference rooms that were filled with executives and team members moving between meetings. It was a far cry from the drama that had unfolded just days earlier on Ethan's flight. As he stepped into the lobby, Ethan felt the weight of his new role settling on his shoulders. He wasn't here as just another business executive anymore. He was here to lead an important conversation about diversity, inclusion, and the systemic changes that needed to happen within the company. Karen McNeil greeted him in the lobby, her expression bright but serious. She had clearly been thinking about their conversation from the night before. "Ethan," Karen said, extending her hand. "Thank you for coming in. I know this isn't what you had originally planned for your trip to New York." Ethan smiled and shook her hand. "Plans change," he replied, "but I think this is more important than any deal I was working on." Karen nodded, and they made their way to the conference room where several other executives were waiting. Ethan recognized a few faces from the previous day's meeting, but today, the atmosphere felt different. There was a sense of anticipation, as if everyone knew that this was going to be just another corporate meeting. Once they were all seated, Karen wasted no time in getting to the heart of the matter. "We've all had some time to reflect on the incident that occurred on Ethan's flight," Karen began, her tone calm but authoritative. "And while we're taking immediate steps to address what happened, it's clear that this issue goes beyond one individual's actions. There's a deeper cultural problem here, one that we need to address if we're going to make meaningful change." Ethan appreciated Karen's directness. It was a refreshing departure from the usual corporate jargon he was used to hearing. "I want to be clear," Ethan said, speaking up. "This isn't just about training programs or public apologies. Those things are important, but they're not enough. We need to change the way we think about diversity and inclusion, from the ground up. That means re-examining everything: how we hire, how we promote, how we treat both employees and customers." There were nods around the room, but Ethan could sense some hesitation from a few of the older executives. One man, David Green, who had been present during the lounge meeting, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Ethan, I don't think anyone here disagrees that we need to address these issues," David said, his voice carefully measured. "But we also need to be realistic. We're running a business. Changes like the ones you're proposing could disrupt operations, and we need to consider how they'll impact our bottom line." Ethan expected this kind of pushback, but he wasn't going to back down. He had seen firsthand the damage that could be done when companies prioritized profits over people. Addressing bias and discrimination isn't just a moral obligation, it's good for business, Ethan countered. Customers are more loyal to companies that reflect their values. If we show them that we're serious about creating an inclusive environment, we'll earn their trust and their business. Karen nodded in agreement, backing him up. Ethan's right. This isn't just about avoiding lawsuits or bad press. It's about creating a culture where everyone, employees and customers alike, feels valued and respected. The room was silent for a moment as the executives digested her words. Ethan could see that not everyone was fully on board yet, but he had made his point. He wasn't here to play it safe. He was here to push for real change. Despite Ethan's determination and Karen's support, not everyone was eager to embrace the changes being proposed. In the weeks that followed, Ethan found himself at the center of growing tensions within the company. While many employees, particularly those from underrepresented backgrounds, welcomed the new initiatives, others were less enthusiastic. David Green, in particular, became a vocal critic of Ethan's efforts. During board meetings, he frequently raised concerns about the costs of implementing the new diversity programs and questioned whether they were really necessary. His resistance wasn't blatant, it was subtle, wrapped in the language of corporate caution and fiscal responsibility. But it was clear that he didn't see the same urgency in addressing the company's cultural problems. One afternoon, after a particularly tense meeting, Ethan found himself alone in the break room, sipping a cup of coffee and trying to clear his head. He had just finished presenting a proposal for a new mentorship program aimed at supporting employees from diverse backgrounds, but the pushback had been stronger than he expected. As he stared out the window, lost in thought, Sarah Bennett, the head of HR, walked in. "You look like you've got a lot on your mind," Sarah said, offering him a sympathetic smile as she poured herself a cup of coffee. Ethan sighed, setting down his cup. "I'm just starting to wonder if I'm pushing too hard. I knew there would be resistance, but I didn't expect it to be this difficult." Sarah leaned against the counter, her expression thoughtful. Change is always hard, especially in a company as big as this one. But you're doing the right thing, Ethan. You're challenging the status quo, and that's never easy. Ethan nodded, but the doubt still gnawed at him. He had come into this role with high hopes, thinking he could lead Sky North toward a more inclusive future. But now, it felt like he was constantly fighting an uphill battle. David Green isn't going to make this easy for you, Sarah continued. He's been with the company for years, and he's very set in his ways. But that doesn't mean you should back down. Ethan appreciated Sarah's support, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the resistance he was facing wasn't just about David or the other executives, it was about something deeper. Corporate culture wasn't something that could be changed overnight. It was ingrained, woven into the fabric of how companies operated. And breaking down those barriers was going to take more than just a few meetings and new policies. As the months went on, the strain of the constant pushback began to take its toll on Ethan. He had been fighting for real, meaningful change at Sky North, but the resistance from within the company was stronger than he had anticipated. Every step forward felt like it was met with 2 steps back. One evening, after another long day of meetings and negotiations, Ethan returned to his hotel room, utterly exhausted. The weight of everything he had been carrying, his new role, the expectations of the company, the pressure from his father, was becoming too much. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his phone. The messages from colleagues, friends, and even strangers were piling up, many of them offering support or asking for updates on his progress. But the constant flood of communication only added to his sense of isolation. Ethan picked up his phone and opened a message from Jessica Hill, the former flight attendant who had reached out to him after the incident on the flight. She had been following his work with Sky North and had been one of the few people to offer him real encouragement during the past few months. Jessica Hill, I know things must be tough right now, but I just wanted to remind you that what you're doing is important. You're making a difference, even if it doesn't always feel that way. Don't give up. Ethan stared at the message for a long moment, feeling a swell of emotion rise within him. He hadn't realized just how closely people were watching him, how much they were counting on him to be their voice. He set his phone down and leaned back against the pillows, staring up at the ceiling. Jessica's words had hit him hard, and they brought with them a wave of clarity. This wasn't just about him. It was about all the people who had been quietly enduring the same kinds of bias and discrimination for years. People who didn't have the platform or the influence that he had. Ethan knew he couldn't quit. He couldn't walk away from this fight, no matter how hard it got. People were counting on him to make a difference, and he wasn't going to let them down. The next morning, Ethan returned to Sky North headquarters with a renewed sense of determination. He knew that pushing for cultural change was never going to be easy, but he had come too far to give up now. If he was going to make a real impact, he needed to approach the problem from a different angle. During a meeting with Karen and the other members of the Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Board, Ethan laid out a new plan. Instead of focusing solely on training and policies, he proposed a comprehensive approach that would involve the entire company. We need to start by looking at how we hire and promote people, Ethan said, his voice steady but firm. It's not enough to just bring in diverse talent, we need to create a system that supports them once they're here. That means mentorship programs, leadership development, and clear pathways for advancement. Karen listened carefully, nodding as he spoke. I agree, Ethan. We've made some progress, but we can't stop now. What do you have in mind? Ethan outlined a series of new initiatives that would address both the immediate issues and the long-term cultural problems within the company. These included creating partnerships with organizations that focused on promoting diversity in the workplace, launching a mentorship program for underrepresented employees, and instituting a more transparent system for tracking and addressing incidents of bias. As Ethan finished his presentation, Karen smiled. This is exactly what we need. Let's make it happen. For the first time in months, Ethan felt a sense of hope. He wasn't just reacting to the problems within Sky North, he was actively shaping the solution. And while he knew there would still be resistance, he was ready to face it head-on. A few months later, Sky North Airlines hosted a major industry conference focused on diversity and inclusion in the airline industry. Leaders from other airlines, as well as representatives from a wide range of industries, attended the event to learn from Sky North's experiences and to discuss how they could implement similar programs in their own companies. Ethan had been invited to speak at the conference, and as he stood backstage, preparing to address the audience, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come since that fateful flight. What had started as a frustrating and humiliating experience had turned into a journey that had pushed him to grow in ways he hadn't expected. As he walked onto the stage, the applause was warm but subdued. The audience was filled with business leaders, HR executives, and diversity advocates who were all eager to hear what Ethan had to say. "Change isn't easy," Ethan began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But it's necessary. We have a responsibility, not just as leaders, but as people, to create environments where everyone feels valued and respected. This isn't about checking boxes or meeting quotas, it's about changing the way we think, the way we work, and the way we treat each other." The audience listened intently as Ethan shared the story of his experience at Sky North and the steps the company had taken to address its cultural issues. He talked about the challenges they had faced, the resistance from within, and the importance of persistence. "When we create cultures of inclusion, we create spaces where people can be their best selves," Ethan said. "And that's good for everyone: employees, customers, and businesses." As he finished his speech, the audience erupted into applause. But for Ethan, it wasn't about the applause. It was about the work that still needed to be done. After the conference, Ethan received messages of congratulations and support from people across the industry. But one message stood out. It was from Emily Davis, the flight attendant whose actions had set everything in motion. She had undergone the airline's new training programs and had been transferred to a different department within Sky North. Emily's message was brief but sincere. "Emily Davis, I know it's been a long time, but I just wanted to thank you. The training we went through opened my eyes to things I didn't even realize I was doing. I'm working with the airline now to help others recognize their own biases. I'm trying to make things right." Ethan stared at the message, feeling a sense of closure he hadn't expected. Emily's actions had hurt him, but her willingness to learn and grow offered a glimpse of the change he had been fighting for. As he sat in his office, reflecting on everything that had happened, Ethan felt a sense of peace. He had built something more than a career, he had built a legacy, one that would last long after he was gone. His phone buzzed with a new message from his father. "Malcolm Carter, proud of you, son. You've done something incredible. This is just the beginning." Ethan smiled, feeling the warmth of his father's words. He wasn't just Malcolm Carter's son anymore, he was Ethan Carter, a man who had forged his own path and made his own mark on the world. And this was only the beginning. A few weeks after the conference, Ethan found himself back in Dallas, sitting in his favorite chair in his office. The afternoon sun filtered through the blinds, casting soft golden light across the room. For the first time in what felt like years, Ethan allowed himself to simply sit and reflect on how far he had come. Sky North Airlines had implemented many of the initiatives he had pushed for, and the company was beginning to see the fruits of that labor. Reports from employees across the organization showed increased morale, especially among underrepresented groups. More employees felt empowered to speak up when they experienced or witnessed bias. It was a small but significant shift. Ethan scrolled through an internal report on the airline's progress. The anonymous reporting system for incidents of discrimination had been expanded, and training programs were being updated regularly to include real-world scenarios and dialogue about unconscious bias. It wasn't a perfect solution. There were still challenges ahead, but it was a start. And in the world of corporate culture, a start was often the hardest part. A knock at the door pulled Ethan from his thoughts. Leah Carter, his mother, stepped into the room carrying 2 cups of tea. She smiled warmly at her son, the same smile that had comforted him through many of life's challenges. "I thought you could use a break," she said, setting one of the cups on his desk. "You've been working non-stop since you got back from New York." Ethan chuckled softly, grateful for the distraction. I guess I'm not good at sitting still, he admitted, taking a sip of the tea. It was chamomile, his favorite. His mother knew him well. Leah sat down across from him, her eyes filled with the quiet wisdom that had always grounded Ethan, even when his father's presence loomed large. You've done an incredible job, Ethan, she said, her voice gentle but firm. I hope you know how proud we are of you. Ethan smiled, but there was a tinge of hesitation in his expression. I do, Mom, but I still feel like there's so much more to do. What we've started at Sky North is a step in the right direction. But the problem is bigger than just one company. Leah nodded, her expression thoughtful. It is bigger, but that's why what you're doing matters so much. You're planting seeds, making people think differently. And those seeds will grow, even if you're not there to see the full harvest. Ethan knew she was right. Change didn't happen overnight, and he wasn't naive enough to think that his work at Sky North had solved the problem. But it was a start, and sometimes a start was all you needed to set something much larger in motion. As they sat together, sipping tea in the quiet of his office, Ethan felt a sense of peace. His mother's presence reminded him that, despite all the challenges, he wasn't alone in this fight. His family was with him, and the legacy he was building was something that would benefit not just him, but future generations as well. The following week, Ethan received a call from Karen McNeil. The company's Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Board had been impressed with Ethan's leadership and wanted him to take on an expanded role. They were offering him a permanent position on the board, not just as a consultant, but as a key decision-maker. This would give him the authority to influence policies across the entire airline industry. Ethan sat at his desk, listening to Karen's proposal, his mind racing with the possibilities. This was a huge opportunity, one that could allow him to push for even more systemic changes within the airline industry. But it also came with its own challenges. Taking on a permanent role would mean more time, more responsibility, and more public scrutiny. Was he ready for that? Ethan, I know this is a big ask, Karen said, her voice sincere, but the work you've done so far has been groundbreaking. We need someone like you who truly understands what it takes to create meaningful change. Ethan paused, weighing the decision carefully. Part of him wanted to jump at the opportunity, but another part of him that had grown weary from the constant fight was hesitant. He had already invested so much time and energy into Sky North, and he was starting to feel the toll it had taken on him. Could he keep going at this pace? You'll need some time to think about it, Ethan said finally, his voice steady. Karen didn't push. Take all the time you need, but just know that we'd be lucky to have you. As the call ended, Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring out the window. He knew that this decision wasn't just about him. It was about the future of the industry and the people who worked within it. The path ahead was clear, but it was also daunting. He had to decide if he was ready to take on that level of responsibility. That evening, Ethan decided to visit his father, Malcolm Carter, at the family's estate. The sprawling mansion had always felt more like Malcolm's domain than Ethan's monument to the elder Carter's success. But today, as Ethan walked through the familiar halls, he felt a sense of calm rather than intimidation. Malcolm was sitting in his study, a glass of scotch in hand, when Ethan entered. The room was filled with bookshelves, business awards, and framed photos of Malcolm with various industry leaders. It was a testament to the life Malcolm had built, a life Ethan had spent years trying to distance himself from. Ethan, Malcolm said, standing up to greet his son. Good to see you. How's everything at Sky North? Ethan smiled, taking a seat across from his father. Busy, he replied. But good. Malcolm studied his son for a moment, sensing that there was more on his mind. Something's bothering you, he observed. You want to talk about it? Ethan took a deep breath, then launched into a recap of his conversation with Karen and the offer to take on a permanent role at Sky North. As he spoke, Malcolm listened intently, his expression thoughtful. When Ethan finished, Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. It sounds like a huge opportunity, he said, but I can see why you're hesitant. Ethan nodded. I've already put so much into this, and I know I can do more. But at the same time, I'm not sure if I'm ready to make this my whole life." Malcolm was silent for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "You've done something incredible, Ethan. You've made a real impact, not just at Sky North, but across the industry. But I think the most important thing is that you find balance. You've always been driven just like me, but you also need to know when to step back and take care of yourself."
Ethan looked at his father, surprised by the vulnerability in his words.
Malcolm had always been the embodiment of hard work and success, but this was the first time he had seen his father acknowledge the importance of balance. "I've made mistakes," Malcolm continued, his voice softer now. "I pushed too hard for too long, and I missed out on things I can't get back. I don't want that for you." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. For years, he had been trying to prove that he didn't need his father's approval, that he could build a career on his own terms. But now, sitting here with Malcolm, he realized that his father's wisdom was something he needed to embrace, not resist. "I appreciate that, Dad," Ethan said quietly. "I just want to make sure I'm doing the right thing." Malcolm smiled, setting down his glass. "You're already doing the right thing, Ethan. You've always known what's best for you. Trust yourself." The conversation with his father left Ethan with a new sense of clarity. He realized that the decision he faced wasn't about choosing between success and personal well-being. It was about finding a way to achieve both. He could continue his work at Sky North, but he didn't have to let it consume him. The next morning, Ethan called Karen to discuss the offer. He wasn't going to accept the permanent role on the advisory board, not yet, at least. Instead, he proposed a middle ground. He would continue to work with Sky North on key initiatives, but he wouldn't commit to a full-time position. This would give him the flexibility to pursue other projects and maintain a healthier balance between work and his personal life. Karen was more than understanding. "Ethan, we're grateful for any involvement you're willing to offer. You've already done so much for us, and we want to make sure you're able to keep doing it without burning out." With that decision made, Ethan felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He could still make an impact, but on his own terms. It was the balance he had been searching for all along. In the months that followed, Ethan continued his work with Sky North, helping to implement new policies and programs that promoted diversity and inclusion across the company. But his involvement extended beyond just Sky North. Other airlines and businesses in various industries began to take notice of the changes happening at the airline. And soon, Ethan found himself being asked to consult on diversity initiatives for other companies. Ethan had never imagined himself becoming an industry leader in this space, but now he embraced the role with open arms. He had found his purpose, not just in making deals and climbing the corporate ladder, but in creating environments where people from all backgrounds could thrive. His work began to ripple across industries. Companies were adopting similar initiatives. Employees were speaking out about their experiences with bias, and corporate cultures were slowly starting to shift. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a steady, meaningful change. One day, Ethan received an unexpected email from Emily Davis, the flight attendant whose actions had sparked his journey at Sky North. She was now working in a different role within the company, focusing on internal training and diversity programs. The email was brief, but it carried weight. "Emily Davis, I'd like to meet. There are things I want to say in person. I hope you'll consider it." Ethan hesitated. He had moved on from the incident, but part of him was curious. Emily had been the catalyst for so much change both in his life and within Sky North. Perhaps this meeting could bring closure. They met at a cafe in New York a week later. Emily arrived first, looking more composed than the last time Ethan had seen her. When he sat down across from her, she smiled nervously, clearly unsure of how to start. "Ethan, I just want to thank you for everything you've done," Emily began. "Not just for the company, but for me personally. That day on the plane, I made assumptions about you that were completely unfair. I didn't realize how deeply ingrained my biases were until I went through the training and started working with the diversity team." Ethan listened, feeling a mix of emotions. He had already forgiven her in his heart, but hearing her acknowledge her mistakes out loud brought a sense of closure he hadn't realized he needed. "I'm not the same person I was back then," Emily continued, her voice steady. "I've learned a lot, and I am still learning. But I just wanted you to know that I'm committed to making sure what happened between us never happens to anyone else." Ethan smiled, genuinely appreciating her honesty. "I'm glad to hear that, Emily. We've all got things to work on, and the important thing is that you're trying to change." As they parted ways, Ethan felt a sense of peace. The journey had come full circle. What had started as a painful experience had evolved into something that had not only changed his life, but had sparked a movement of change within Sky North and beyond. Months later, Ethan stood at the front of a conference room, addressing a group of young professionals who had gathered for a leadership summit. He had been invited to speak about his journey, about the challenges he had faced, the lessons he had learned, and the legacy he was building. As he looked out at the faces in the audience, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. These young leaders were the future, and they were hungry for the kind of change Ethan had spent his career fighting for. They wanted to create workplaces that valued diversity, inclusion, and respect for all employees, regardless of their background. "Leadership isn't just about climbing to the top," Ethan said, his voice strong and confident. "It's about lifting others up with you. It's about creating a culture where everyone has the opportunity to succeed, where everyone's voice is heard." The room was silent as Ethan shared his story, from the incident on the plane to his work at Sky North and the impact it had on the industry. He spoke about the challenges he had faced, the resistance he had encountered, and the victories, both big and small, that had made the fight worth it. As he finished, the audience erupted into applause. But Ethan wasn't thinking about the applause. He was thinking about the future, the work that still needed to be done, the conversations that still needed to happen. He wasn't just Malcolm Carter's son anymore. He was Ethan Carter, a man who had built his own legacy, one rooted in the values of fairness, respect, and inclusion. And he knew that this was only the beginning. As the sun set over Dallas, Ethan stood on the balcony of his apartment, looking out at the city that had been his home for so many years. The journey he had embarked on had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. It had tested him, pushed him to his limits, and forced him to grow in ways he never imagined. But now, as he stood there, he felt a sense of peace. He had found his purpose not in following his father's footsteps, but in forging his own path, one that was grounded in his values and driven by a desire to make the world a better place. His phone buzzed with a message. It was from his father. "Malcolm Carter, proud of you, son. You've done something incredible. This is your legacy." Ethan smiled as he typed out a reply. "Ethan Carter. Thanks, Dad. I couldn't have done it without you." As he put his phone away and looked out at the horizon, Ethan knew that his journey was far from over. There was still so much more to do, so many more battles to fight. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to take on whatever came next. He wasn't just building a career. He was building a legacy, one that would last long after he was gone. And this was only the beginning. It appears we've reached a natural conclusion to the story of Legacy Unseen. However, if you'd like to extend the narrative further, we can explore various avenues, such as Ethan Carter's future challenges in maintaining his legacy, the impact of his work beyond Sky North, or even diving deeper into the lives of supporting characters like Malcolm Carter or Emily Davis. For the sake of continuity and expanding on the story without violating any policies, I'll now create an epilogue to provide additional closure and potential opportunities for further stories. Ethan Carter stood at the edge of the stage, watching as the audience gathered for the opening keynote of the annual Global Diversity Summit in New York City. The past year had been a whirlwind, countless meetings, speeches, interviews, and a growing influence that had far exceeded even his own expectations. But today felt different. Today, he wasn't just another speaker today. He was being recognized as one of the key figures driving change across multiple industries. The conference hall buzzed with excitement as people from all walks of life took their seats. CEOs, activists, employees, and scholars had come together, eager to discuss and collaborate on ways to further diversity, inclusion, and equity within the corporate world. Ethan had been invited to deliver the closing address, a testament to how much his role had expanded since his first steps into advocacy at Sky North Airlines. Ethan took a deep breath, scanning the room. He knew some of the faces in the audience, colleagues, old friends, and new partners who had joined him in the fight for change. But there were also many people he didn't know, people who had been inspired by the work he had done. It was humbling and a little overwhelming. But most of all, it was a reminder of why he had started this journey in the first place. After stepping back from a full-time position on Sky North's advisory board, Ethan had made it his mission to take his message further. He had consulted for other airlines, advised major corporations in finance, tech, and manufacturing, and worked with government organizations to help shape policies around workplace equality. His approach was pragmatic, but always grounded in the values he had come to hold dear: fairness, respect, and inclusion for all. He had also written a book, Redefining Leadership: The Future of Inclusion, which became a bestseller in the business world. It was part memoir, part manifesto detailing his own journey and offering a roadmap for other leaders who wanted to create cultures of inclusivity within their organizations. The book had opened doors he hadn't even known existed. Invitations poured in from across the world to speak at conferences, advise on diversity councils, and mentor rising leaders. But for all the success, Ethan remained grounded, knowing that the real work was in the everyday conversations and the small steps people took to challenge the biases that had become so deeply embedded in society. The impact of his work was beginning to ripple outward, but it wasn't always easy. While there were many who supported him, there were also critics, people who saw his initiatives as a threat to tradition or questioned the necessity of such drastic changes in the workplace. But Ethan had learned how to navigate that criticism with grace, choosing to focus on the people who stood to benefit from the changes rather than those who resisted them. On the personal front, Ethan had grown closer to his family. His relationship with his father, Malcolm Carter, had evolved into one of mutual respect. They no longer saw each other as competitors or as father and son with diverging views. Instead, they had come to understand that their respective legacies, while different, were rooted in the same values: perseverance, hard work, and a commitment to making the world a better place. Ethan had also reconnected with friends he hadn't spoken to in years, and his support system grew beyond just his family. Jessica Hill, the former flight attendant who had initially reached out to him, had become one of his closest allies. She had followed a similar path, taking on a leadership role at another airline where she worked to implement similar diversity initiatives. Their friendship had deepened over time, and together they often collaborated on new projects and programs. And then there was Emily Davis. Her journey of personal reflection and growth had led her to become an advocate for change within Sky North. She had committed herself to making sure no one else experienced what Ethan had gone through, and her work within the airline's diversity team was already making a significant difference. It was a story of redemption, one that Ethan hadn't expected but was grateful for. They still spoke occasionally, and while they weren't exactly friends, there was a shared understanding between them. The experience had transformed them both, each in different ways, and their paths, while initially crossing under tense circumstance, had ultimately led to growth. As the lights in the conference hall dimmed and the murmur of voices quieted, Ethan's thoughts snapped back to the present. His name was announced, and a wave of applause followed him as he walked onto the stage. He paused for a moment, taking in the energy of the room before stepping up to the microphone. "Good evening," Ethan began, his voice steady and confident. "When I started on this journey, I didn't know where it would lead. What began as a personal experience, a moment of feeling out of place, unseen and unheard, became the catalyst for something far greater than I ever imagined." He looked out over the audience, scanning the faces of people who had come from different industries, backgrounds, and countries. "But this isn't just my story. It's the story of countless other people who have felt marginalized, overlooked, or judged not for their abilities, but for the way they look, where they come from, or who they love." Ethan paused, letting his words sink in. We've made progress, and that's worth celebrating. But we still have a long way to go. The work of inclusion is never finished, it's an ongoing process. It's about the choices we make every day, in the boardroom, in the office, and in our communities. The audience was silent, listening intently. Each of us has a role to play in shaping the future of our workplaces and our society. And it's not just about policies or programs. It's about creating a culture where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued. A culture where differences aren't just tolerated, they're celebrated. Ethan's voice grew stronger, more impassioned as he continued. We have the power to shape the future, to create environments where everyone can thrive. But that requires commitment. It requires us to look at ourselves, our biases, and our systems, and ask, is this the best we can do? And if the answer is no, we have to be brave enough to change it. As he wrapped up his speech, the applause was thunderous, but Ethan wasn't focused on the applause. He was focused on the work that still lay ahead, the future leaders who would continue the fight, the systems that needed to be overhauled, and the individuals who would step up to push for progress. Ethan knew that his role had changed. He had built a legacy. Yes, but now it was about planting seeds for others to take that legacy even further. Later that evening, Ethan found himself standing on the rooftop of his hotel, looking out over the New York skyline. The city lights shimmered in the distance, and the cool breeze brought a sense of calm. His phone buzzed with another message. This time it was from Karen McNeil. Karen McNeil. Congratulations, Ethan. You've made us all proud. Let's talk soon about our next steps. I have some exciting ideas for where we can take this movement. Ethan smiled, feeling the warmth of Karen's words. He replied with a simple, looking forward to it. As he slipped his phone back into his pocket, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. His journey wasn't over, it was evolving. The world was changing, slowly but surely, and he was playing a part in that transformation. For years, Ethan had wrestled with his identity, with the weight of being Malcolm Carter's son, with the pressure of building his own legacy. But now he understood that legacies weren't static, they were dynamic, ever-growing. And as long as he stayed true to his values, he knew he was on the right path. The night stretched on, full of promise and potential. And as Ethan gazed out at the city below, he couldn't help but feel excited for the future, for the challenges, the victories, and the continued fight for a world where everyone, no matter who they were, could rise to their full potential. This was his legacy, and it was just the beginning. As Ethan gazed out at the city below, he couldn't help but feel excited for the future, for the challenges, the victories, and the continued fight for a world where everyone, no matter who they were, could rise to their full potential. This was his legacy, and it was just the beginning. If you've enjoyed this story of Ethan's journey toward leadership and change, make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated on more inspiring stories like this one. Don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts below. Together we can keep the conversation about diversity and inclusion going. I was thinking about it too, James said, his voice quiet but reflective. It feels like so much has happened, but at the same time, it's hard to believe how far we've come. Mildred nodded, her eyes misting over with emotion. I never thought I'd live to see the day when this town could change like this. For so long it felt like we were stuck. But you showed us something different. You showed us that we could be better. James felt a lump form in his throat. I didn't do it alone, Mildred. It's been all of us. People like you, Rachel, Emily, Tommy even. Mildred chuckled softly. Maybe, but we all needed someone to remind us what we were capable of. That's what you did, James. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching the sunset over the park. It was a quiet, reflective moment, one that reminded James of why he had stayed, why he had chosen to fight for this town. It's not over, James said, more to himself than to Mildred. There's still work to be done. There's always more to be done, Mildred replied with a knowing smile. But you've given this town something it didn't have before: hope. Meanwhile, Emily Green had been working on her biggest story yet. The pieces she had written for the local paper had caught the attention of a national magazine. and they had commissioned her to write a long-form feature about the transformation of Hollow Creek. She had spent months interviewing people: James, Tommy, Rachel, Sheriff Nate Johnson, and countless others. She poured her heart into the article, determined to capture the essence of what had happened in this small town. It wasn't just a story about racism or a fight for equality. It was about community, about resilience, about the power of one person's actions to ignite change. When the feature was published, it was an instant success. Readers from across the country were moved by the story of Hollow Creek, and Emily was flooded with messages of support. People wanted to know more. How had the town done it? How could they replicate that success in their own communities? For Emily, it was a deeply personal victory. She had grown up in Hollow Creek, and for a long time, she hadn't believed that the town could change. But now, as she read the responses to her article, she knew that anything was possible. The next spring, the first integrated class graduated from Hollow Creek High School. It was a historic moment, not just for the students, but for the entire town. The graduation ceremony was held in the town square, and the entire community showed up to celebrate. James was there, sitting in the front row with Mildred, Tommy, and Rachel, all of them beaming with pride. Lily Sanders, Mildred's granddaughter, gave the valedictory speech, speaking eloquently about the future, about unity, and about the lessons they had learned from the town's struggles. "We are the generation that will carry this town forward," Lily said, her voice clear and strong, "and we will do it together. Because we've learned that we are stronger when we stand as one." The crowd erupted into applause, and as the graduates tossed their caps into the air, there was a sense of triumph, of new beginnings. Hollow Creek had come so far, and now a new generation was ready to take the reins. As the town continued to grow and change, Harold Brooks made a surprising announcement. He was bringing back the name Rose's Diner. But this time, the name would reflect something different. Harold stood outside the diner, addressing a small crowd of onlookers. James, Mildred, and the rest of the diner's regulars were there, curious about the announcement. "Rose's Diner was named after my mother," Harold began, his voice filled with emotion. "She was a kind woman, a woman who believed in treating everyone with respect. But somewhere along the way, we lost sight of that. We let this place become a symbol of division." Harold paused, glancing at James, who gave him an encouraging nod. "But now I want to reclaim that name," Harold continued. "This diner is going to stand for something new, something my mother would be proud of. It's going to be a place where everyone is welcome, where everyone has a seat at the table." The crowd cheered, and as the new sign for Rose's Diner was unveiled, it felt like a fitting tribute to the town's journey. As summer approached, Rachel Morales prepared to leave Hollow Creek once again, this time for good. Her work had taken her to other towns and cities, and while she had grown deeply attached to Hollow Creek, she knew it was time to move on. On her last night in town, she gathered with James, Emily, and the others at Rose's Diner for one final meal. The atmosphere was warm and nostalgic, filled with laughter and shared memories. "I'm going to miss this place," Rachel admitted as she sipped her coffee. "But I know you all are going to keep the momentum going." "Well, miss you too, Rachel," James said, smiling warmly. "But don't worry, we've got this." They spent the rest of the evening reminiscing about the town's journey, about how far they had come, and about the road that still lay ahead. When it was time to say goodbye, there were hugs, tears, and promises to keep in touch. But as Rachel drove away from Hollow Creek the next morning, she left knowing that the town was in good hands. Several months after Rachel's departure, James received a letter from her. He sat on his porch, the autumn air crisp and cool, as he read her words. "Dear James, I hope this letter finds you well. I've been thinking about Hollow Creek a lot lately, and I wanted to check in. I've been working with a community out west, and it reminds me so much of where Hollow Creek was when I first arrived. But seeing the progress we made gives me hope that change is possible, no matter where you are. I just wanted to thank you once again for everything you've done for the town and for me. You've taught me so much about patience, about perseverance, and about how change really happens. You'll never forget our time together. Take care of yourself, James, and take care of Hollow Creek. With gratitude, Rachel. James smiled as he folded the letter, tucking it into his pocket. Rachel's words were a reminder that their work was far from over, but it was also a reminder of how much they had already accomplished. Over time, Tommy Barnes fully embraced his role as a leader in the town's new direction. He became a regular volunteer at the community center, working with young people who, like him, had once been resistant to change. One afternoon, as Tommy sat on a bench outside the center, talking with a group of teenagers, he realized just how far he had come. The anger and fear that had once controlled him were gone, replaced by a sense of purpose. "I used to think change was something to be afraid of," Tommy told the teens, "but now I see it's what makes us better. We can't grow if we don't open ourselves up to new ways of thinking." The teens listened intently, nodding in agreement. Tommy's journey had become an inspiration to many, showing that it was never too late to change. 1 year after the March for Unity, the town of Hollow Creek came together once again to celebrate. The town square was filled with music, food, and laughter, as people from all walks of life gathered to reflect on the progress they had made. James stood with Sheriff Nate Johnson, Emily Green, and Lily Sanders, watching the festivities with a deep sense of pride. The town was thriving, its people united by a shared vision of a better future. As the sun set over the town, casting a golden glow over the square, James felt a quiet sense of contentment. Hollow Creek had been through so much, but they had come out the other side stronger, more resilient, and more united than ever. In the years that followed, Hollow Creek continued to evolve. The town's story became a beacon of hope for other communities struggling with their own divisions. People came from far and wide to visit Rose's Diner, to see the mural painted by the teenagers, and to meet the people who had made change possible. But for James, it wasn't about the recognition. It wasn't about being a hero or a leader. It was about the quiet, steady work of building a community where everyone had a place. As he sat on his porch one evening, watching the stars twinkle above the town, James felt a deep sense of peace. He knew that the fight for justice was ongoing, that there would always be more work to do. But for now, in this moment, he was content. Hollow Creek was his home, and it was a home worth fighting for. As the story of James and Hollow Creek shows, change takes courage, community, and a willingness to stand up for what's right. If you've been inspired by their journey, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that remind us of the importance of unity, justice, and hope. And remember, your voice matters. Let us know in the comments how this story touched you and what kind of stories you'd love to hear next. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. It's still hard sometimes, but I feel like we're finally free. Edith smiled, her heart swelling with pride for Rachel. She had come so far, and though there were still challenges ahead, Edith knew that Rachel had the strength to face them. "I'm so proud of you," Edith said softly. "You're doing such a good job, Rachel. You and the girls are going to be just fine." Rachel hesitated for a moment, then her voice softened. "We couldn't have done it without you, Edith. You saved us. I'll never be able to thank you enough for everything you've done." Tears welled in Edith's eyes, and she wiped them away with a smile. "You're family now, Rachel, and family takes care of each other." As Edith hung up the phone, a sense of calm settled over her. She had faced her fears, stood up to Derek, and helped Rachel and the girls escape a dangerous situation. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Her home, once a place of quiet solitude, had become a symbol of strength and resilience. And her neighbors, once strangers, had become a community, united by a shared sense of purpose. Life on Cedar Street would never be the same again, but that was okay. Because now it is filled with hope, connection, and the promise of a better future. Edith smiled as she stepped out into her garden, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the roses. She knelt down, her hands gently tending to the flowers, feeling the cool earth beneath her fingertips. There was still work to be done, but now she knew she wasn't doing it alone. In the weeks that followed Derek's final confrontation, a new sense of peace settled over Cedar Street. The neighborhood watch remained vigilant, but the need for constant worry had lessened as Derek's presence faded from their lives. He hadn't returned, and the restraining order kept him at a safe distance from Edith's home, and from the shelter where Rachel and the girls were living. Edith found herself breathing easier with each passing day, the weight of fear slowly lifting from her shoulders. One crisp autumn morning, as Edith was pruning her roses, she heard the familiar ring of her phone from inside the house. She wiped her hands on her gardening apron and hurried to answer it, her heart lifting when she saw Rachel's name on the caller ID. "Rachel, it's so good to hear from you," Edith said, a smile spreading across her face as she held the phone to her ear. "Hi, Edith," Rachel replied, her voice filled with warmth. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Not at all, dear. Just tending to the garden. How are you and the girls doing?" Rachel let out a small sigh, though it was one of relief rather than stress. "We're doing really well, actually. The girls are starting to settle in at school, and they're making new friends. We've been staying at the shelter for a while now, but I've been working with a caseworker. And, well, we found a place. It's a small apartment, but it's ours." Edith's heart swelled with joy at the news. "Rachel, that's wonderful. I'm so happy for you. I couldn't have done it without your help, Edith." "Really? I mean it. You were there for me when I didn't know what to do. I'll never be able to thank you enough." "You've already thanked me more than enough, Rachel," Edith said gently. "I'm just glad you and the girls are safe and moving forward." "We are," Rachel agreed, her voice steady. "We still have some hard days, but we're starting to rebuild. I'm learning how to live without looking over my shoulder all the time. The girls, they've been through so much, but I think they're going to be okay." Edith felt a tear slip down her cheek, and she wiped it away with a smile. "You're an incredible mother, Rachel. You've given them the chance to have a better life, and that's the most important thing." "Thank you," Rachel whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "I wanted to ask, would you like to come visit us when we're settled into the apartment? The girls miss you, and I'd love for you to see our new place." "I'd love that," Edith replied without hesitation. "I can't wait to see how far you've come." After they said their goodbyes, Edith stood in the quiet of her kitchen, a deep sense of pride and peace settling over her. She had been part of something important, helping Rachel and her daughters escape a dangerous situation and start a new life. Knowing that they were safe and thriving gave Edith a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in a long time. But Edith also knew that healing wasn't just for Rachel and the girls. She, too, had been deeply affected by everything that had happened. For so long, Edith had lived in a world of solitude, wrapped in the memories of her past life with Richard. But now she realized that she had the power to create new connections, to make a difference in the lives of others. Her small, quiet world had expanded in ways she never could have predicted. A few weeks later, Edith stood in front of the door to Rachel's new apartment, her heart racing with anticipation. She held a basket filled with homemade cookies and a small potted plant, a housewarming gift for Rachel and the girls. As she knocked on the door, she couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement and pride. Rachel had taken such brave steps toward building a new life for herself and her daughters, and Edith was eager to see the progress they had made. The door opened, and there stood Rachel, her face lighting up with a wide smile. "Edith, you made it." "Of course I did," Edith replied warmly, stepping inside and hugging Rachel. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." The apartment was small but cozy, filled with the warmth and light that Edith had come to associate with Rachel. The walls were adorned with colorful artwork, some drawn by Lily and Ivy, and the space felt alive with the energy of a family building something new. Edith smiled as she took it all in, her heart swelling with pride for Rachel's resilience. "Look who's here!" Rachel called out. And moments later, Lily and Ivy came bounding into the room, their faces bright with excitement. "Grandma Edith!" they exclaimed in unison, rushing toward her and wrapping their arms around her. Edith laughed, bending down to hug the girls. "Oh, my dears, it's so good to see you." "We missed you," Ivy said, her voice small but filled with warmth. "Can you stay for dinner?" "I wouldn't dream of leaving before dinner," Edith replied, her heart swelling with affection for the girls. As they settled into the living room, Rachel brought out a pot of tea, and the four of them spent the afternoon catching up, laughing, and sharing stories. The girls proudly showed Edith their artwork, and Rachel talked about how they were adjusting to their new school and making friends. "They're doing so well," Rachel said, her voice filled with relief and pride. "I wasn't sure how they would handle all the changes, but they've been so strong. I'm so proud of them." "You should be proud of yourself too," Edith said gently. "You've created a safe, loving home for them. That's everything." Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening with tears of gratitude. "I still can't believe we made it. There were times when I thought we'd never get out, but now we have a chance at a real life." As the afternoon turned into evening, the conversation grew deeper, and Edith and Rachel found themselves reflecting on everything that had happened over the past few months. There had been so much pain, fear, and uncertainty, but now there was also hope. They had made it through the storm, and now they were standing on the other side, ready to rebuild their lives. "I never thought I'd feel free," Rachel admitted quietly, her voice heavy with emotion. "But now I wake up every morning knowing that I'm safe, that my girls are safe. And that's everything." Edith reached out and took Rachel's hand, squeezing it gently. "You deserve this peace, Rachel. You and the girls deserve all the happiness in the world." Rachel nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "And you deserve it too, Edith. You've been through so much yourself. You've given us a new start, and I hope you know how much that means to me." Edith smiled, her heart full. "We've given each other a new start." Later that evening, after dinner, and one last round of hugs from Lily and Ivy, Edith said her goodbyes and made her way back to her own home. As she walked down the quiet street, she felt a deep sense of contentment. Life had changed in ways she never could have predicted, but it was better, now richer, fuller, and filled with new connections. Rachel and the girls had become like family to her, and Edith knew that their bond would only grow stronger as they continued to support one another in the days ahead. As the autumn leaves began to fall and the air turned crisp, Edith found herself spending more time in her garden, reflecting on the past few months. So much had changed, not just for Rachel and the girls, but for Edith as well. Her life, once quiet and isolated, had been transformed by the relationships she had built and the strength she had discovered within herself. But with that transformation came a deeper understanding of the weight she had been carrying for so long: grief, the loneliness, the sense of being left behind. Richard's death had left a hole in Edith's life, one that she had tried to fill with routine and solitude. But now, with Rachel and the girls in her life, Edith realized that she didn't have to carry that weight alone anymore. One afternoon, as Edith sat in the garden with a cup of tea, she found herself thinking about Richard. She missed him every day, missed his laugh, his warmth, the way he had always made her feel safe and loved. But for the first time in a long time, Edith felt a sense of peace when she thought of him, peace in knowing that he would have been proud of her for everything she had done to help Rachel and the girls. As she sipped her tea, Edith decided it was time to visit Richard's grave. She hadn't been in a while, and she felt a strong pull to go to tell him about everything that had happened, about the new life she had found after all these years. The next day, Edith drove to the cemetery where Richard was buried. The drive was quiet, the fall colors painting the landscape in shades of gold and red. When she arrived, Edith made her way to Richard's headstone, a small smile on her face as she placed a bouquet of fresh roses at his grave. "Hello, love," she said softly, her voice filled with affection. "It's been a while, but I've been busy. I have so much to tell you." For the next hour, Edith sat by Richard's grave, telling him about Rachel, about the girls, about everything that had happened since they had moved into the neighborhood. She talked about how she had found new strength within herself, how she had made new friends, and how she had learned that it was never too late to make a difference in someone's life. "I think you'd be proud of me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know I've still got a lot of life left to live, and I'm going to make the most of it. I'll carry your love with me, always." As Edith stood to leave, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She knew that Richard was still with her, in spirit, and that his love would continue to guide her in the days ahead. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. As the winter holidays approached, Cedar Street came alive with the warm glow of twinkling lights and the festive spirit of the season. Edith, who had once dreaded the long, lonely winter months, now found herself filled with a sense of anticipation and joy. The neighborhood had changed so much in the past few months, and Edith felt more connected to her community than ever before. Rachel and the girls had invited Edith to spend Christmas with them in their new apartment, and Edith had gladly accepted. It was a far cry from the quiet, solitary holidays she had spent in years past, and she was looking forward to celebrating with people she cared about. On Christmas Eve, Edith arrived at Rachel's apartment with a basket full of gifts and homemade treats. The girls greeted her at the door, their faces bright with excitement, and Edith couldn't help but laugh as they pulled her inside. "We've been waiting for you," Lily exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with joy. Mom made hot chocolate. Edith's heart swelled with affection as she followed the girls into the cozy living room where Rachel was waiting with a warm smile. The apartment was decorated with twinkling lights and a small Christmas tree, and the air was filled with the comforting scent of cinnamon and pine. "Welcome, Edith," Rachel said, hugging her tightly. "We're so glad you're here." "I wouldn't want to be anywhere else," Edith replied, her voice full of warmth. As they sat together by the fire, sipping hot chocolate and exchanging stories, Edith felt a deep sense of contentment. This was what she had been missing for so long, a sense of connection, of belonging, of family. The evening passed in a blur of laughter, conversation, and warmth. The girls opened their presents with wide-eyed excitement, and Edith marveled at how far they had come since the dark days of living under Derek's control. They were happy, healthy, and full of life, and Edith knew that Rachel had done an incredible job of creating a safe, loving home for them. Later that night, after the girls had gone to bed, Rachel and Edith sat together by the fire, reflecting on everything that had happened over the past year. "It feels like a lifetime ago," Rachel said quietly, her eyes focused on the flickering flames. "Sometimes I still can't believe we made it out." "But we did." "You did," Edith corrected gently. "You found the strength to leave, and now you and the girls have a bright future ahead of you." Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Edith. You were there when I needed someone the most, and I'll never forget that." Edith reached out and took Rachel's hand, squeezing it gently. "We've been there for each other, and we'll keep being there, no matter what comes next." As they sat together in the quiet of the night, Edith felt a deep sense of peace settling over her. The storm was over, and now it was time to move forward to embrace the future with open arms, knowing that they had all found the strength to survive and thrive. And in that moment, Edith knew that everything would be all right. Thank you for following along with Edith's emotional and inspiring journey. If you found this story moving or relatable, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on more powerful stories like this. We'll be bringing you more heartwarming tales of resilience, community, and the strength of the human spirit. And don't forget to click the notification bell so you'll always be the first to know when new content is available. We value your feedback, so if you enjoyed this story, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for being part of our storytelling community, and stay tuned for more stories that remind us all that no matter how hard things get, we are never truly alone.